It was 1943, and the world was falling apart. The war was everywhere. The sound of bombs, the sharp calls of soldiers, the endless tension in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. In a small, forgotten village tucked away in Eastern Europe, the war felt even heavier. It was as if the trees, the rivers, and the homes themselves had been stained by the chaos of it all. The village wasn't much to look at: narrow cobblestone streets, little houses with cracked windows, and the scent of smoke in the air. A place that had once been peaceful, where everyone knew each other, now felt like a ghost of what it had been. Every day, people went about their lives with the quiet fear of what might happen next, the sound of gunfire and marching soldiers a constant reminder of how close the war had come. But then there was her. Lily Carter, a name that didn't sound like it belonged in such a place, but somehow, it did. She was the village's pianist, though her talents had been silenced by the war for months. The grand piano she played sat in the corner of an old, dusty hall that nobody really used anymore, except for her. She would come, in the silence of the late evening, when the last of the soldiers had returned to their barracks or taken cover for the night, and she would play. The piano had seen better days. The keys were chipped, the wood creaked, but to Lily, it was the only escape from the world outside. Her long brown hair, usually tied up in a messy bun, would fall loosely around her shoulders as she played. She was in her late 20s, not much older than a lot of the soldiers passing through, but her face showed the kind of weariness that came with surviving a world turned upside down. Her hazel eyes, often lost in thought, could brighten when she played, like she was giving all of herself to the music. The hall where she played was also the oldest building in the village. The floors were worn and creaky, the walls cracked with age, but there was something comforting about it, almost nostalgic. It smelled like dust, wood, and a little bit of mildew, but Lily had always found it beautiful. She loved how the sound of the piano echoed off the walls, the music carrying through the air like a soft, comforting breeze. It was late one night when it happened, the first time he heard her. Lily had been playing a piece she'd written herself. It was a melody full of longing, sadness, and something else, hope, maybe. She poured her heart into it, even though she knew no one was listening. Or so she thought. From the shadows at the doorway, watching her without her knowing, was a soldier. His name was Jack Thompson, though everyone just called him Thompson. He was part of a battalion that had been stationed in the village to protect it from the advancing enemy forces. His uniform was stained with dirt, his boots heavy from the endless patrols. He was young, barely in his 20s, with dark brown hair, and a look in his eyes that made him seem older than he was. Thompson had wandered into the village that night, away from his duties, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He needed to escape, even if just for a moment. That's when he heard the music. It was like a beacon in the dark. A soft, melodic sound cutting through the night air. He couldn't resist following it. He stepped into the hall, standing just beyond the doorframe, out of her sight, as Lily played the last few notes of her song. The moment the final chord rang out, the room fell silent. Thompson stood still, breathless. The music hung in the air like it had been meant just for him. Lily's fingers lingered on the keys, but then she heard it, a faint sound from the doorway. Her heart skipped, and she turned quickly, surprised to find a figure standing there. The man was tall, dressed in military uniform, but his face wasn't hardened like the others she had seen. There was something different about him. "Sorry," Thompson said, stepping forward, his voice low but clear, like he didn't want to break the silence. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Lily's eyes softened as she looked him over. There was something almost fragile about him, something that made her feel like she could trust him. She smiled slightly, the corners of her mouth curving in a way that made her look younger, almost shy. "You didn't disturb me," she replied, her voice soft but with a trace of warmth. "I didn't know anyone was still out there." Thompson nodded, stepping further into the room, his boots making soft sounds on the old wooden floor. I heard the music. It was beautiful. I haven't heard anything like it in a long time. Lily's fingers rested on the piano's keys, her gaze drifting to the man who had appeared out of nowhere. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful look. It's just something I play when I can't sleep. A way to make sense of things. Thompson didn't answer right away, his eyes wandering over the room. It was obvious the hall had seen better days, like everything else in the village. But somehow, with the music and the dim light from the flickering candle on the piano, it felt like something more. It felt like a small slice of peace in a world that had forgotten what that even was. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. I understand, he said quietly. Sometimes, the world feels like it's falling apart, doesn't it? Lily looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't just some soldier. There was a depth in his eyes that made her heart ache, a kind of sadness she couldn't explain. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like hope stirring inside her. Maybe it was the music. Or maybe it was the man standing before her, with his quiet strength and sorrowful eyes. She didn't know. But something was about to change. The days in the village passed slowly, like time itself had gotten stuck in the mud of war. The soldiers came and went, carrying their orders with stiff faces and tired eyes. The villagers kept to themselves, whispering in hushed tones, their lives dictated by fear. But for Lily and Thompson, something had shifted. After that first night, Thompson kept finding reasons to pass by the old hall. He never said much at first. He would listen as Lily played, standing quietly in the shadows like a ghost. And she never asked him why he came. She didn't need to. His presence was enough, like an unspoken understanding between them. One night, he finally broke the silence. "That piece you play," he said, his voice hesitant, almost as if he were afraid to disturb the moment. "The one you played the first time I heard you. Did you write it?" Lily looked up from the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. His uniform looked heavier than usual tonight, the weight of it pulling his shoulders down. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his dark eyes had that faraway look again. "I did," she said finally. "It's not finished, though. I don't think it ever will be." Thompson frowned. "Why not?" Lily shrugged, a small, bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "Because how do you finish something when the world feels so unfinished? Every time I sit down to complete it, something stops me. Like there's more to say, but I don't know what it is." Thompson nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I get that," he murmured. "There's so much left undone. So many things I thought I'd have time for." His voice trailed off, and Lily's heart clenched. She wanted to ask him what he meant, what ghosts haunted him, but she didn't. She wasn't sure she could bear to hear the answer. Instead, she stood, pushing the piano bench back with a soft scrape. "Come here," she said, motioning toward the piano. Thompson hesitated, his brow furrowing. "What?" "Just come here," she repeated, her tone gentle but insistent. Reluctantly, he stepped closer, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden floor. Lily gestured to the bench, and he sat down awkwardly, his broad frame looking out of place next to the delicate piano. She slid onto the bench beside him, her shoulder brushing his lightly. "Here," she said, taking his hand and placing it on the keys. His hand was rough, calloused, and warm against hers. "Press this one." He did as she said, the note ringing out softly in the quiet room. She guided his hand to another key, then another, creating a simple melody. Thompson's lips twitched into a small smile, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "See," she said, her own smile widening. "Even a soldier can play." He chuckled, the sound low and soft, but it filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I don't think I'll be giving you any competition anytime soon," he said, his tone lighter than it had been in days. For the first time since they'd met, the heaviness between them seemed to lift, even if only for a moment. They stayed like that for a while, their hands brushing against the keys, creating a halting, imperfect melody that somehow felt perfect in its imperfection. But the war didn't care about moments like this. And neither of them could forget that. The next evening, Thompson didn't show up. Lily waited, her heart sinking as the hours passed. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that he was just another soldier passing through, but the ache in her chest said otherwise. The village was quieter than usual that night, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Lily sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, unable to play. She stared at the empty doorway, hoping, praying, for Thompson to walk through it. Instead, she heard shouting. The sound came from the square, sharp and urgent. Lily's heart jumped as she stood, her pulse pounding in her ears. She rushed outside, her feet slipping on the uneven cobblestones, and saw a group of soldiers gathered near the center of the village. Thompson was there, standing with his hands raised. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Another soldier, a higher-ranking officer Lily didn't recognize, was yelling at him, his voice harsh and accusing. "He's a traitor," the officer barked, pointing at Thompson like he was spitting venom. "Caught him passing information to the enemy." Lily's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She knew it couldn't be true. Thompson wasn't a traitor. He couldn't be. But the other soldiers didn't hesitate. They grabbed him roughly, forcing him to his knees. "No," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step forward, then another, her hands trembling at her sides. Before she could reach him, the officer turned, his sharp eyes locking onto her. "And who are you?" he demanded. "What's your connection to this man?" Lily froze, her mind racing. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend Thompson, but the words wouldn't come. The officer sneered. "I see. Another sympathizer." "Wait!" Thompson shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "She's not involved. She doesn't know anything." The officer ignored him, turning back to his men. "Take him," he ordered. "And keep an eye on her." The soldiers dragged Thompson away, his struggling form disappearing into the shadows. Lily stood frozen, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She didn't know how, but she had to save him. The hours after Thompson was taken felt like an eternity. Lily couldn't sit still. She paced the narrow confines of her small home, her mind a storm of fear and determination. The village felt suffocatingly quiet that night, every sound amplified, the creak of her floorboards, the soft whistle of the wind through the cracks in her window. She couldn't stop seeing his face. The way he had looked at her before being dragged away. The way he had tried to shield her, even when he was the one in chains. "He saved me," she thought, her chest tightening. "I can't just let them take him." By the time dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky with soft streaks of gray and pink, Lily had made up her mind. She didn't know much about soldiers or war, but she knew the village, its hiding places, and its secrets. If anyone could find a way to reach Thompson, it was her. She pulled on a long coat, the fabric worn but warm, and slipped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. The village was still, save for a few soldiers patrolling lazily near the edge of the square. Lily kept her head down, her heart hammering in her chest as she passed them, hoping they wouldn't notice her. The makeshift barracks where the soldiers had taken Thompson were at the far end of the village, in an old, abandoned brewery. The building was large and foreboding, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. During the day, it blended into the landscape, but at night, it seemed to loom over the village like a silent sentinel. Lily approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows. She crouched behind a stack of wooden crates near the side entrance, her breath visible in the chilly morning air. She could hear voices inside, 2 guards, their tones bored and uninterested. "Doesn't even make sense," one of them was saying. "Why would he do it? Thompson's been solid since the day he got here." "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "Orders are orders. They'll deal with him soon enough." Lily's stomach churned. She didn't have much time. Inside the brewery, Thompson sat on a cold, hard floor, his hands tied in front of him. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long shadows across the walls. His head rested against the stone, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He looked exhausted, his uniform dirty and torn, but there was a quiet resolve in his expression. When the door creaked open, he tensed, expecting another soldier. But instead, a familiar figure slipped inside, a woman with long brown hair and a determined look in her hazel eyes. "Lily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shoo," she hissed, kneeling beside him. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the knots around his wrists. "We don't have much time." "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with equal parts relief and fear. "If they catch you." "They won't," she interrupted, her tone firmer than she felt. "I'm not leaving you here." Thompson stared at her, his expression softening. "You're crazy, you know that?" Lily managed a faint smile. "Probably. Now shut up and let me get you out of here." Just as she loosened the last knot, they heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. "We have to go," she whispered urgently, pulling Thompson to his feet. He winced, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, but he didn't protest. Together, they moved toward the back of the room, where a narrow staircase led down to the brewery's old storage cellar. It was a gamble. Lily didn't know if the cellar had another exit, but it was better than waiting to be caught. The staircase groaned under their weight as they descended, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The cellar was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of dawn seeping through a small, grated window near the ceiling. Barrels and crates were stacked haphazardly, their shapes casting eerie shadows. "Do you know where we're going?" Thompson asked quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. "No," Lily admitted, her breath hitching. "But we'll figure it out." They moved quickly, weaving through the maze of barrels, until they found a rusted metal door at the far end of the cellar. Lily pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. She bit her lip, panic creeping in. "Let me," Thompson said, stepping forward. He braced himself against the door and shoved with all his strength. The hinges groaned loudly, but the door didn't move. "Stop," Lily whispered sharply, glancing over her shoulder. "They'll hear us." Thompson nodded, his jaw tightening. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old crowbar leaning against the wall. He grabbed it and wedged it into the door's edge, using it as leverage. With a final grunt, the door gave way, swinging open with a deafening screech. They froze, their hearts pounding as the noise echoed through the cellar. "Down here," a voice shouted from above. Lily grabbed Thompson's hand, pulling him through the door. They emerged into an overgrown courtyard, the grass slick with dew and the scent of wildflowers hanging in the air. The sky was lightening, streaks of gold and blue spreading across the horizon. "Run!" Thompson urged, his voice urgent. They sprinted toward the tree line, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Behind them, shouts and the clatter of boots grew louder. Lily's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As they disappeared into the forest, the weight of what they had done settled over them. They were fugitives now, hunted by both the enemy and their own. But for the first time in a long time, they were free. And together, the forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the faint chirping of early morning birds, and their hurried footsteps crunching against the undergrowth. The air smelled fresh, damp with dew, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the village. But the forest offered little comfort. It felt vast and unfamiliar, its tall trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Lily stumbled over a root, her chest heaving as she tried to keep up with Thompson. His hand was firm around hers, steadying her as they pushed deeper into the woods. Every few seconds, he glanced back, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll search the forest first." Lily nodded, too breathless to speak. Her heart pounded in her chest, not just from running but from the weight of what they'd done. She had no plan, no idea where they were going. All she knew was that they couldn't stop, not yet. After what felt like hours, they came to a small clearing. The sunlight filtering through the trees painted the ground in patches of gold. Thompson slowed, letting go of her hand as he crouched to catch his breath. Lily sank to her knees beside him, her legs trembling. "We can't keep this up forever," she said between gasps, her voice tinged with frustration and fear. "They'll find us." "Not if we stay smart," Thompson replied, his tone calm but firm. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small compass. The glass was cracked, but the needle still pointed north. "There's a resistance group a few miles from here. If we can reach them, they might help." Lily frowned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Resistance? How do you know about them?" Thompson hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I've worked with them before. They're not far, but the terrain gets rough. We'll need to stay hidden." Lily studied him, her hazel eyes narrowing. He was hiding something, she could feel it. But now wasn't the time to press. She had to trust him, at least for now. "Then let's go," she said, pulling herself to her feet. The deeper they went into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of a twig, the distant call of a bird, even the rustle of their clothes as they moved. It was as if the forest itself was watching them. Thompson led the way, his movements careful and deliberate. Lily followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously around them. She had never been this far from the village before, and the unfamiliarity of it all made her chest tighten. As they climbed over a fallen log, Thompson suddenly raised a hand, signaling her to stop. Lily froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" she whispered. Thompson held a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. Then she heard it too, a faint rustling, coming from somewhere to their left. It was too deliberate to be the wind. Thompson motioned for her to stay low, crouching behind the log. Lily followed suit, her breath shallow as she tried to stay as quiet as possible. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Lily's pulse raced. She gripped Thompson's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. He didn't flinch, his gaze fixed on the direction of the noise. After a moment, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent again, the tension so thick it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then, a voice, a woman's, low and cautious. "Thompson? Is that you?" Thompson's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. He rose slowly from behind the log, his hands visible. Lily stayed where she was, her body coiled like a spring. "Marie?" Thompson called out, his voice steady. From the shadows of the trees emerged a figure, a woman with short, dark hair and sharp green eyes. She was dressed in a patched coat and sturdy boots, a rifle slung over her shoulder. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the forest well. "Damn it, Thompson," the woman said, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. "You're supposed to be dead or captured. What the hell are you doing here?" "It's a long story," Thompson replied, glancing back at Lily. "But I need your help." Marie's eyes flicked to Lily, her expression unreadable. "And who's this?" "Lily Carter," Thompson said. "She's the one who got me out." Marie raised an eyebrow, her gaze lingering on Lily. "A pianist?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Lily straightened, narrowing her eyes. "Is that a problem?" Marie smirked faintly, shaking her head. "No. Just unexpected." Thompson stepped closer to Marie, his voice lowering. "Listen, we don't have time for introductions. The soldiers are looking for us. Can you take us to the camp?" Marie hesitated, her expression hardening. "You know how risky that is. Bringing outsiders." "She's not a threat," Thompson interrupted, his tone firm. "She saved my life. And you owe me, Marie." The two of them locked eyes, the air between them charged. Finally, Marie sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said. "But if this goes south, it's on you." Thompson nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. He turned to Lily, motioning for her to follow. "Come on." As they disappeared deeper into the forest, Lily felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She didn't know who this Marie was or what kind of world Thompson had just dragged her into, but one thing was certain: their journey was far from over. The forest seemed to thicken as they followed Marie, the trees growing taller and the undergrowth denser. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy now, leaving the path ahead shrouded in dim, green-tinged light. Marie led the way with confident strides, moving as though the forest were an extension of herself. Thompson stayed close behind her, his expression unreadable, while Lily trailed a few steps back, her mind a storm of questions. Marie glanced over her shoulder, her sharp green eyes narrowing as they landed on Lily. "You're quiet," she said. "Don't tell me you're regretting this already." Lily straightened, squaring her shoulders. "I'm just trying to keep up. And wondering why you're so comfortable marching through a forest with two people you barely know." Marie smirked, a hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Thompson's not just anyone," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "And you? You're either braver than you look or incredibly stupid." Lily's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I'd say brave. But thanks for the vote of confidence." Thompson glanced back, his lips twitching into the faintest of smiles before he turned his attention back to the path. Marie didn't respond, but Lily caught a fleeting look of approval in her expression before she resumed leading them deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow stream, its crystal-clear water bubbling softly over smooth stones. Marie knelt by the edge, motioning for them to do the same. "We're close," she said, dipping her hand into the water and taking a quick drink. "But we'll have to move carefully from here. The camp's well hidden, but they're not big on unexpected visitors." Lily frowned, brushing her tangled hair out of her face. "Why so much secrecy? Aren't you all on the same side?" Marie's laugh was short and bitter. "That's a nice thought. But the resistance isn't exactly one big happy family. Trust doesn't come easy when betrayal can mean a bullet in the back." Lily shivered at the cold bluntness of her words. Thompson, however, didn't seem fazed. He crouched beside Marie, his voice low and even. "We'll follow your lead." Marie studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. Then she stood, motioning for them to follow. "Stay close. And no talking." They moved in silence now, every step deliberate. The forest seemed to close in around them, the dense undergrowth muffling their footsteps. Lily's heart raced as she tried to keep up, her eyes darting nervously at every rustle or shadow. Finally, Marie stopped, raising a hand. "There," she whispered, pointing to a cluster of trees ahead. At first, Lily didn't see anything. But as she squinted, shapes began to emerge, small, camouflaged huts built into the trees, nearly invisible against the foliage. A few figures moved between them, their movements quick and purposeful. "Welcome to our little slice of freedom," Marie said quietly, a hint of pride in her voice. As they stepped into the camp, all eyes turned to them. The resistance fighters were a mixed group, men and women of all ages, their faces weathered and resolute. Some carried rifles slung across their backs, while others tended to supplies or worked on repairing equipment. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A man approached, his graying hair pulled back into a ponytail and a pistol holstered at his hip. His sharp eyes scanned the newcomers, lingering on Thompson before shifting to Lily. "Marie," he said, his tone even but authoritative. "Who are they?" "This is Thompson," Marie replied, her voice steady. "You've heard of him?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "The deserter?" Lily's stomach dropped at the word. She looked at Thompson, who stood tall, his jaw set but his expression calm. "Former soldier," Thompson corrected, his voice firm. "And I'm here because I want to help." The man's gaze didn't waver. "And her?" he asked, nodding toward Lily. "Lily Carter," Thompson said before she could respond. "She saved my life. Without her, I wouldn't be here." The man studied Lily for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Thompson. "We'll see about that. For now, you're both under observation. We can't afford risks." Marie stepped in, her voice sharp. "Victor, they're not a threat. I vouched for them." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And if you're wrong, it's on you." Marie didn't flinch, her gaze steady. "Understood." Victor gave a curt nod before turning to address the rest of the camp. "Get them some food and a place to rest," he ordered. "But keep an eye on them." As the group dispersed, Thompson exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing. He turned to Lily, his eyes softening. "You okay?" Lily nodded, though her hands were trembling. "Yeah. I just didn't expect all this." "You'll get used to it," Marie said, her tone dry. "Or you won't. Either way, you're here now." Lily didn't respond. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this, a world of shadows and secrets, where trust was as scarce as sunlight. She glanced at Thompson, his face thoughtful as he stared into the distance. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, what he was hiding. But she wasn't sure she was ready for the answers. The camp was alive with quiet activity as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Small fires dotted the area, their flickering light illuminating the resistance fighters as they went about their tasks, repairing weapons, stitching torn clothes, or simply sitting in muted conversation. It was a strange mix of chaos and calm, and Lily felt like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. After a meal of stale bread and thin soup, she and Thompson were led to a small, makeshift tent near the edge of the camp. The tent smelled faintly of damp fabric and wood smoke, its interior sparse but functional. A couple of rough wool blankets were spread out on the ground, offering some comfort against the cold. Thompson sat cross-legged on one of the blankets, his hands resting on his knees. His gaze was distant, his brow furrowed in thought. Lily hesitated before sitting across from him, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Just trying to figure out our next move." Lily frowned. "I thought the plan was to stay here, work with the resistance." "For now," he said, his tone cautious. "But this place, it's not as safe as it seems. They're suspicious of us, of me. And they have every reason to be." Lily studied him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you not telling me, Thompson?" Who are you really? He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I told you the truth, mostly. I was a soldier, but I didn't just leave. I was working undercover, trying to get information about enemy operations. Things went south, and I had to disappear. And the resistance, she pressed. They were supposed to be my backup, he admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. But plans changed. Now I'm not sure who to trust. Lily stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to be angry, to demand why he hadn't told her everything sooner. But deep down, she understood. In a world torn apart by war, trust was a fragile thing. Before she could respond, the tent flap rustled, and Marie stepped inside. Her sharp green eyes flicked between them before settling on Thompson. Victor wants to see you, she said, her tone curt. Both of you. Victor's tent was larger and sturdier than the others, its interior lit by a single oil lamp. Maps and documents were spread across a wooden table, and a small fire crackled in a stone hearth. Victor stood behind the table, his arms crossed, while two other resistance fighters flanked him. Their expressions were unreadable, their postures tense. Sit, Victor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Thompson and Lily exchanged a glance before taking the seats offered to them. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with unspoken tension. Victor leaned forward, his sharp eyes boring into Thompson. I don't like strangers, he began. Especially ones with your reputation. So if you want to stay here, you're going to prove yourself. Thompson's jaw tightened. And how do you propose I do that? Victor smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. We've intercepted information about a supply convoy passing through the forest tomorrow night. Weapons, medical supplies, the kind of haul that could keep us going for months. But it's heavily guarded. You want us to help with the ambush, Thompson said, his tone flat. I want you to lead it, Victor corrected. If you're really who you say you are, this should be easy for you. Thompson didn't respond immediately. His face was a mask of calm, but Lily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists. And me? Lily asked, surprising herself with the boldness of her question. Victor's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, she thought he might dismiss her entirely. But then he nodded. You go with him. We'll see if you're as brave as he claims. Marie, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. Victor, this is reckless. They've just arrived. They want to prove themselves, Victor interrupted, his tone sharp. This is their chance. The room fell silent. Thompson met Victor's gaze, his expression hard. Fine, he said finally. We'll do it. Lily's heart sank, fear and uncertainty clawing at her chest. But she couldn't back out now. Not after everything they had been through. That night, as they lay in the tent, the reality of what lay ahead settled over them like a heavy weight. Lily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions and doubts. You don't have to do this, Thompson said quietly, breaking the silence. I can handle it. Lily turned to him, her expression resolute. I didn't come this far to stand on the sidelines. Thompson smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're braver than you know. As the fire outside crackled and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this ambush would change everything. For better or worse, their fates were now entwined with the resistance's. And tomorrow, they would face their first true test. The forest was unnervingly still as the group crouched in the undergrowth, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The moon hung low, casting pale light through the skeletal branches, creating shifting shadows. The convoy rumbled in the distance, the faint sound of engines breaking the silence. Lily gripped the pistol Thompson had given her, her hands trembling. Beside her, Thompson adjusted his rifle with calm precision, his blue eyes scanning the dark forest. Marie crouched a few feet away, her sharp gaze fixed on the approaching vehicles. "This is it," Thompson said, his voice low but steady. "Stay close, Lily. No matter what happens." Lily nodded, her heart pounding. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't cut out for this. And yet, here she was, about to ambush a convoy in the dead of night. The thought made her stomach churn. The lead truck's headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Behind it, 2 more trucks followed, their cargo unknown but vital enough to warrant heavy security. The convoy slowed as it neared the fallen tree Marie had rigged earlier, a crude but effective roadblock. Marie gave the signal, a sharp whistle that sliced through the night. Chaos erupted. Thompson's rifle cracked as he fired, the sound echoing through the forest. The resistance fighters emerged from their hiding places, their shouts mingling with the panicked cries of the convoy guards. Lily stayed low, her heart hammering as she watched the battle unfold. A soldier spotted her, his rifle swinging in her direction. Before she could react, Thompson was there, taking him down with a precise shot. He turned to her, his expression a mix of urgency and concern. "Lily, move." She scrambled to her feet, following him toward the second truck. Marie was already there, her rifle slung over her back as she climbed into the cargo bed. The crates were marked with symbols Lily didn't recognize, but Marie's grin told her all she needed to know. "Medical supplies," Marie said, her voice triumphant. "This is what we came for." Lily helped Marie shove one of the crates off the truck, her hands trembling with effort. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. This wasn't just survival. This was a chance to make a difference. "Fall back." Victor's voice rang out over the chaos. "We've got what we need." Thompson grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the trees. Gunfire still echoed around them, but the resistance fighters were already retreating, their mission a success. Back at the camp, the mood was celebratory. The stolen supplies were stacked in the center, and the fighters gathered around, their faces lit with relief and pride. Victor stood at the edge of the group, his sharp eyes surveying the scene. "You proved yourself," he said to Thompson, his tone begrudging but sincere. "We'll see what you're really worth in the days ahead." Thompson nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll do our part." Lily sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of tea. The warmth was comforting, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the soldier she had shot, the look of surprise and pain on his face before he fell. She thought of the music she had once played, the way it had brought people together, not torn them apart. Thompson joined her, his presence grounding. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted. "Killing people, fighting like this, it's not who I am." Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "It's not who I am either," he said. "But sometimes, we do what we have to. And we hold on to the things that make us human." Lily nodded, her gaze drifting to the stars visible through the canopy above. She thought of her piano, the one she had left behind in the village. A melody began to form in her mind, a haunting, bittersweet tune that spoke of loss and hope, of fear and courage. "Play it for me," Thompson said, as though reading her thoughts. She looked at him, a small smile breaking through her sadness. "One day," she promised. "When this is over." Thompson smiled back, and for a moment, the weight of the war seemed to lift. Years later, in a quiet house far from the battlefields, Lily's granddaughter found an old music box tucked away in an attic chest. The box was intricately carved, its wood worn smooth with age. When she opened it, a hauntingly beautiful melody filled the room, a song that spoke of a time long past, of a pianist and a soldier, and the love that carried them through the darkest days. Inside the lid, etched in delicate script, were the words, "For those we lost, and for the hope we found." And though the granddaughter didn't know the full story, she could feel the weight of it in every note.